The rain hadn't stopped for hours, each droplet drumming a relentless rhythm against the corrugated metal roof. Inside the dimly lit shelter, the smell of damp straw and wet fur clung to the air. She was huddled under a threadbare blanket, trembling not from cold, but from the quiet ache of fear that had rooted her in one corner for far too long. Everyone else had walked past, eyes fixed on schedules, routines, and paperwork, but not him. He tilted his head, ears pricked, nostrils flaring with the raw scent of despair. His paws made no sound on the wet floor, but his presence was thunderous. He nudged the corner of the blanket with his wet nose, hesitant at first, almost asking permission. And then, with the precision of someone who had learned patience through suffering, he pulled the blanket away. There was a pause so heavy it pressed against every heartbeat in the room. Time seemed to hold its breath. The team stopped, frozen, staring at the fragile bundle of fur and trembling limbs. Something shifted in that moment, a quiet recognition. Rescue wasn't just about saving a life. It was about breaking through fear with a touch, a gaze, a heartbeat shared. The alley reeked of damp decay, a stubborn odor that clung to everything it touched, rotting cardboard, rusted metal, and the faint tang of urine that had soaked the cracked concrete days ago. He crouched in the deepest shadow he could find, a small, skeletal form wrapped around itself like a coil of despair, trembling not from the cold alone, but from the persistent, gnawing ache of abandonment. Every muscle in his body was taut, each movement a calculated risk. His ears flicked constantly, catching the slightest rustle of garbage or the whisper of the wind through broken chain-link fences. A single drop of rain fell from a torn awning above, splashing onto his back, the cold sting driving another shiver through his frail frame. He lifted his head cautiously, nostrils flaring, eyes scanning the alley. A distant dog barked, a sharp, threatening yelp, and he ducked instinctively, letting the shadows swallow him whole again. The world had been unkind. Hands that once reached toward him had instead grabbed, struck, or abandoned. Faces had blurred into indistinct shapes, some soft with fleeting kindness, most hard with indifference. The memory of warmth felt like a dream he could no longer trust. Yet even in this desolation there was a flicker, a small pulse of hope that he didn't quite understand but couldn't entirely extinguish. He had learned to move silently, to shrink against walls, to make himself as unnoticeable as the drifting fog that slithered along the gutters. Every sound was amplified. The distant drip of water, the scraping of metal cans rolling across uneven stones, the creak of an old gate swinging with the wind. Each was a potential threat, each a reminder that safety was an illusion. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. Yet there was something different this time, a softness, a rhythm that didn't command, didn't threaten. He froze mid-shiver, eyes narrowing, muscles coiled. His gaze pierced the dim alleyway, catching the silhouette of someone crouched low, one hand extended as if to bridge the distance without breaking the fragile barrier of fear. The stranger's presence was strange yet oddly compelling. There was no urgency in the motion, no tremor of impatience, only a quiet insistence, a patient drawing near. He sniffed the air, nostrils flaring, trying to parse the scent. There was something familiar, something almost like safety, though he had not known it for years. A soft voice reached him then, almost a murmur, like wind through hollow reeds. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The words were tentative, but they carried a strange authority. He shifted slightly, hesitant, muscles trembling from the effort of choosing trust over fear. The hand inched closer, fingertips brushing against the damp concrete before daring to lift toward him. He flinched, a small growl escaping his throat, low and uncertain, vibrating in the pit of his chest. The stranger didn't pull back. Patience hung in the air like a palpable weight, an unspoken contract that said, "I will wait. I will not rush you." Minutes passed, each one stretched like hours. He inched forward, paw by paw, driven by a mixture of hunger, curiosity, and the faintest whisper of hope. The hand finally made contact, brushing the tip of his nose gently. Hesitation, then recoil. Hesitation, then sniff. Hesitation again. Each repetition etched the fragile contour of trust. The alley seemed to hold its breath. Rain drummed on the roof above, louder now, punctuating the rhythm of small victories. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the warmth of the hand seep into the frost of his memory. Not all humans hurt. Some might help. But fear was persistent, a shadow that refused to lift. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to disappear into the darkness. Yet curiosity and the need for safety tugged at him with equal force. He allowed himself a tentative step forward, a sniff at the stranger's sleeve. The hand remained steady still, an anchor in a sea of chaos. The soft murmur of reassurance continued, words he didn't understand fully, but the cadence mattered more than content. Safe, 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 safe. He blinked, ears twitching, muscles taut yet soft. His tail, long hidden under his trembling body, gave the briefest flick, almost imperceptible, but the first acknowledgement that he might, and just might, consider companionship over solitude. A sudden sound, akin rolling across the alley, made him jump violently, knocking against a discarded crate. The stranger's hand steadied him before he could retreat entirely, fingers splayed like a lifeline. He froze, eyes wide, every instinct screaming in alarm. The stranger crouched lower, voice soft and insistent. "I know it's scary, but you don't have to run anymore." The words wrapped around him, a fragile cocoon against the night and rain. For the first time, he felt something that hadn't touched his ribs in months, the possibility of protection. Maybe the world could be different. Maybe not everyone carried hands that hurt. Slowly, the shift began. He inched closer, paw sliding onto the stranger's boot, nose lifting to press briefly against the warmth of skin. There was a pause, a silent negotiation, a delicate balance between instinct and hope. The stranger didn't push, didn't speak louder. Patience was the only language that mattered now. A soft cloth dangled from her bag, a small token, and she allowed him to approach it, sniffing the unfamiliar texture. Curiosity overcame fear just slightly, the corners of his mind expanding enough to imagine possibility beyond the alley wall. Hours could have passed, and it might not have mattered. Time existed only in breaths, heartbeats, and the rhythmic fall of rain. The stranger's patience wove a thread of trust, fragile yet persistent, stitching small openings in the layers of fear. He pressed closer, tentative but deliberate, and allowed a small, careful brush of his head against her palm. The world didn't collapse. No sudden pain, no betrayal, just warmth, just quiet. And in that moment, the alley, gray, decayed, forgotten, transformed into the first place he could imagine as safe. Evening deepened, shadows lengthened, and the rain softened to a whisper. He curled into himself briefly, testing the reality of stillness, of absence of threat. The stranger's presence was no longer a question but a steady reassurance, a constant amid uncertainty. The faint glimmer of hope, once almost invisible, had taken root. He lifted his head to watch her, eyes softening, ears relaxing. He was not yet free of fear, but he had discovered that fear could coexist with trust, that caution could meet compassion, and that the smallest act, a hand, a word, a touch, could fracture the walls he had built over countless nights of abandonment. As the alley darkened into night, punctuated by the occasional drip of residual rain, he stayed close, not out of obedience but choice. He tested the boundaries gently, paw sliding across the stranger's outstretched hand, nose nudging her fingers. Each contact carried significance, a heartbeat of connection that had been missing for far too long. The world remained a fractured place, full of noise, sharp edges, and unseen threats, but now there was a single constant, her presence. And within that constant, he sensed possibility. Within that patient, careful presence, he could imagine a life where fear was tempered with care, where shadows did not own him completely. The night closed around the alley, soft and damp, yet inside him, a new rhythm emerged. Breaths slowed, muscles relaxed slightly, heartbeats aligned with the quiet patience of another soul who refused to give up on him. He had been abandoned, yes, left to shadows and decay, but in this precise, fragile moment, a bridge had been built. Trust, small and tentative, stretched across the gap between despair and hope. And though the alley remained cold, wet, and gray, he could feel the faintest warmth of possibility, a pulse that promised that tomorrow might not just be survival, but connection, and perhaps, eventually, belonging. The morning air was damp, carrying the sharp tang of wet grass and the faint smoke of distant chimneys. Light filtered through ragged clouds, pale and diffused, casting the shelter in a muted gray glow. He sat just inside the doorway, paws tucked beneath him, watching every movement with a predator's caution and a prisoner's hesitation. The warmth of the stranger's hand from the alley had lingered, like an echo of a dream he wasn't sure he deserved. Yet each footstep inside this new, strange space sent spikes of tension through his body. The shelter smelled of disinfectant and straw, of other animals and human presence, a world both alien and vaguely familiar. Every creak of floorboards, every rustle of a blanket made his muscles coil in anticipation. He wanted to trust, but trust demanded courage he hadn't practiced in years. The stranger knelt again, placing her hands on the ground, fingers splayed in a silent invitation. The movement was deliberate, slow, non-threatening, and yet he studied it like a puzzle, wary of deceit. Rainwater dripped from his fur, and he shook violently, flinging droplets across the floor. The sound startled him. He jumped and pressed his body flat against the wall, but she did not flinch. Her voice, soft and melodic, wrapped around him like a lullaby. "I won't hurt you. I just want to help." Each word, a thread of calm, stitched itself into the frayed edges of his nerve endings. He inhaled cautiously, nostrils flaring, catching the warmth of her scent mixed with the lingering perfume of damp rain and soap. It was alien but grounding, a tether to a reality that wasn't steeped in betrayal. He inched forward, paw by paw, testing the distance between fear and curiosity. Every muscle trembled with tension, yet each step was a negotiation, a dialogue without words. The stranger remained still, steady, allowing the rhythm to unfold naturally. When his nose finally brushed against the back of her hand, it was barely perceptible, a ghost of contact, yet it resonated with significance. The tiniest exhale of acceptance passed through him. It was not surrender, not yet, but the first chapter of trust had begun. She whispered softly, "It's okay, you're safe now," letting the sound of her breath, steady and calm, serve as anchor points in the storm of his anxiety. The world outside seemed to dissolve as he circled her, sniffing cautiously, ears flicking at every ambient noise, tail low but swaying faintly, a tentative acknowledgement of possibility. The shelter's walls were lined with cages, each a silent witness to previous rescues, yet each seemed to pulse with tension and expectation. Other animals stirred in the distance, their faint sounds like reminders of the fragility of life, yet he remained focused on her. Every subtle movement she made, breathing, blinking, shifting weight, was cataloged in the delicate ledger of his instincts. He tested her patience by retreating suddenly, ears pinned, tail tucked, only to return seconds later, drawn by the invisible promise of safety. Time elongated. Minutes stretched, folding upon themselves, each one filled with careful experimentation. He nudged her fingers gently with his nose, pulling back at the first hint of pressure. She did not flinch, did not attempt to force the contact. She simply remained present, a steady rhythm in a chaotic world. His head pressed lightly into her palm, shaking slightly, and she allowed it, murmuring words of gentle encouragement. There was no rush. There was no expectation. Only the fragile bridge of touch and patience connecting two lives scarred by fear and neglect. A sudden sound, a metal tray clattering against the floor, made him bolt instinctively, pressing against the far wall. She froze for a heartbeat, then crouched lower, speaking in calm, even tones, coaxing him without demanding. "I know it's scary, but I'm not going anywhere." Each word was a lifeline, pulling him back from the brink of instinctual flight. The rain outside had slowed to a whisper, the shelter dim and quiet, amplifying every small interaction into a profound negotiation of trust. His eyes flicked to her constantly, seeking reassurance, parsing micro-expressions like survival codes. As hours passed, subtle shifts began to emerge. He allowed his head to rest on her lap briefly, then jerked away, testing limits, learning boundaries. She adjusted, her movements slow, deliberate, respecting his pace, whispering words of encouragement. Every inch gained was monumental, every retreat a reminder that fear had long governed his life. Yet in these fragile gestures, trust started to take root. Her fingers stroked lightly along his back, each motion careful not to overwhelm. He responded with quiet leaning, a tentative nudge, a brief lick of her hand, moments that shimmered with significance. The world, once a menacing blur, seemed to focus into a narrow, safe corridor between them. He explored his environment with cautious curiosity. The cages, the blankets, the straw-strewn floor, all became landmarks in a slowly expanding map of safety. Each human presence, each carefully placed object was catalogued in his memory with attention to detail born of survival. Yet the stranger's hand remained a constant, a reference point in this otherwise unpredictable landscape. He learned to anticipate its movement, to align his own steps with its rhythm. The first touch had evolved into a sequence of micro-interactions, a language of patience, respect, and reciprocity. Evening settled in with a gentle amber haze filtering through the shelter windows. He lay partly on the floor, partly leaning into her, a posture both defensive and exploratory. The tension in his muscles had not fully dissolved, but it had softened. He permitted a gentle sigh, small but audible, an acknowledgement that the world might not be entirely dangerous. She continued to murmur, sometimes in words, sometimes in quiet hums, letting the vibration of her presence resonate through him. A soft blanket was laid nearby, and though he did not immediately claim it, he approached it slowly, sniffing, brushing it lightly with his nose, a tentative claim to comfort. This chapter of interaction, fragile and delicate, had established a rhythm of trust. Each step forward was a negotiation, each retreat a lesson in patience. The bridge between fear and acceptance had begun to take shape, small yet resilient, stretching across the chasm carved by years of neglect. Outside, the last drizzle of rain glinted on the metal roof, casting faint reflections into the shelter, subtle patterns that seemed to dance in tandem with his cautious movements. The room pulsed with quiet life, each sound amplified by stillness, the soft scrape of paws, the faint exhale of breath, the low hum of anticipation. By nightfall, he had taken several deliberate steps toward full engagement, head resting briefly against her lap, paw touching her hand, tail flicking with restrained excitement, small victories accumulated like precious stones in a treasure chest. He had not yet surrendered to full trust, but he had discovered the possibility of it. Every fiber of his being remained vigilant, but the sharp edges of fear had softened slightly. Connection, he realized, could coexist with caution. Safety, even if temporary, could be tangible, and the stranger, patient and unwavering, had become both anchor and lighthouse, guiding him slowly out of the shadows into a world where touch could mean safety, presence could mean protection, and the first touch could grow into a language of trust that might, one day, heal everything. The storm had arrived with the subtle fury of a world testing both patience and courage. Rain hammered against the shelter roof in relentless sheets, pooling in corners and dripping from rafters like fractured silver threads. The wind whistled through gaps in the walls, rattling doors and scattering the scent of wet straw and damp fur throughout the room. He sat in the corner, fur slicked and matted, eyes wide and unblinking, muscles coiled like springs. Every new gust made him flinch, every clatter of metal against concrete a reminder of unpredictability. The world outside, with its harsh driving rain and the echo of distant thunder, mirrored the turbulence within him, fear and distrust, still raw, still alive. The shelter smelled of everything at once: antiseptic, wet animals, and the faint lingering odor of human hands that carried both promise and caution. He padded softly along the floor, tail low, sniffing each blanket, each corner of straw-strewn space, mapping territory with meticulous care. The humans moved around him with quiet determination, voices soft yet firm, steps deliberate, never sudden. The stranger, the one who had first coaxed him from shadows, was everywhere and nowhere at once, a presence that radiated calm. She knelt near him as he circled a new patch of wet concrete, hand extended like a slow bridge. Each touch, each brush of fingers against his fur, was a negotiation of trust. The storm outside seemed to magnify every movement. The rattling of the shelter door sounded like a threat. A stray clap of thunder resonated through the walls, vibrating through his bones. He flinched, back arching, muscles tightening, instincts screaming for flight. Yet she remained close, her presence a counterweight to chaos. Her voice was steady, deliberate, almost musical. "I'm here. You don't have to run." Every syllable wrapped around him like a lifeline, each vibration a tether pulling him from instinctual retreat into the tentative embrace of safety. Slowly, paw by paw, he ventured closer, nose twitching, ears swiveling, eyes darting to every shadow. Hours passed in this delicate dance. He explored the blankets, sniffed the corners of cages, tested boundaries with short, sharp retreats, and hesitated returns. She mirrored his rhythm, matching each pause with patience, each cautious step with unwavering stillness. Occasionally, he would press his head lightly against her hand, then jerk away at the slightest movement. It was a fragile balance, a negotiation of instinct versus desire. The storm outside had become a backdrop, a natural echo of the inner turbulence of two beings learning to exist in synchrony. Food was offered, small and tentative portions, placed carefully to avoid sudden movement. He approached with caution, sniffed, retreated, and circled before allowing a nibble. The act of eating, once mundane, became monumental, a test of trust, a step into a world where survival need not be constant vigilance. She watched, silently counting breaths, whispering encouragement, adjusting distance with a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. Even in the simplest gestures, the smallest interactions became profound. The brush of fur against fingers, the soft click of claws on concrete, the sighs and shivers of bodies learning to coexist. The storm's crescendo mirrored a sudden, sharp emotional spot. He slipped through an open door, paws splashing into the shallow puddles outside. Instinct screamed flight, heart hammered in rapid, erratic beats. She was on him instantly, crouching low, voice calm yet urgent, hands steady and sure. The world had contracted to a narrow tunnel of tension. Rain lashing, wind screaming, heartbeats synchronized with adrenaline. His body pressed against her, trembling, paws scrambling. And for a moment, the storm outside and the storm within became indistinguishable. Yet through the chaos, connection persisted, her hands wrapped around him like anchors, every stroke, every whisper grounding him against instinctual panic. Evening descended with damp silver light, rain softening into persistent drizzle. The shelter, once a cage of anxiety, became a refuge. He circled, sniffed, and tentatively approached blankets laid out near the warmth of heaters. Fur slick but glimmering in the soft glow, eyes alert yet less frantic, he tested comfort. He allowed brief head rests against a hand, moments so fleeting yet monumental. Each contact was a silent promise. The world had edges and dangers, but this space offered boundaries defined by safety, not fear. Trust, though fragile, was now a tangible thread linking two lives scarred by unpredictability. Night arrived with a gentle hush, the storm reduced to soft tapping against metal and glass. He lay curled on the blanket, ears twitching occasionally, tail half hidden, yet tension eased. Her presence was constant nearby, breaths measured, fingers occasionally brushing the fur along his back. The subtle rise and fall of her chest, the soft whisper of reassurance, became a heartbeat he could finally align with. Moments of connection deepened, a paw nudging her hand, a soft whine of contentment, eyes meeting hers without the flicker of fear. The storm outside, once overwhelming, had become a distant drumbeat, a reminder that chaos could exist alongside calm, and that patience could temper terror. In this chapter of adjustment, growth became visible. He no longer flinched at every shadow, no longer jumped at the slightest sound. His exploration of the shelter was measured, careful, yet curious. He learned the rhythm of human presence, the subtle signals of intention, the cadence of hands and voices. Even the other animals, once a source of potential threat, became part of the map of his new world, a complex tapestry of smells and sounds that no longer demanded absolute vigilance. Trust, once a fragile spark, now flickered steadily, enough to allow tentative play and investigation of the world beyond instinctual survival. The night ended with quiet reflection in the stillness of the shelter. He lay partially stretched on the blanket, paws brushing the stranger's hand, fur damp but gleaming faintly in the dim light. His breathing had slowed, muscles relaxing into a fragile earned comfort. Every heartbeat echoed the lessons of the day: patience, connection, resilience. The storm outside was now a backdrop to growth, not a mirror of fear. In the muted light, he allowed himself to imagine a life beyond constant vigilance, a life defined by presence, care, and the slow, deliberate unfolding of trust. By the time the last drizzle faded, he had taken full ownership of the shelter space, exploring corners he had once avoided, accepting gentle touches without instinctive recoil. Humans were no longer enemies, at least not this one. Presence, patience, and persistence had proven stronger than the instinct to flee. The bridge between terror and trust had been tested, and it had held, even if only barely. The room fell quiet again, yet his vigilance did not falter entirely. He sniffed along the walls, explored corners he had avoided, paws slipping slightly on damp concrete, fur glistening in the soft shelter light. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, balancing the tension of instinct with the pull of safety. She knelt nearby, speaking softly, guiding gently, letting him lead the dance of trust. Food was offered, small bits placed strategically, and he accepted, pausing to sniff, tasting, retreating, and returning in careful cycles. Every bite, every sniff, every tentative pause step reinforced the fragile understanding. Safety existed not as an abstract promise, but as a tangible reality. Suddenly, A moment of pure stillness. He froze, eyes wide, nostrils flaring, tail low but flicking subtly. The stranger extended her hand, palm flat, inviting him closer. Time slowed. Every heartbeat was amplified, every breath a drumbeat echoing in the quiet. The choice was monumental yet simple: retreat into fear or step forward into trust. Muscles tensed, paws shifting, he inched closer, sniffing, testing, acknowledging the presence that had saved him countless times already. Then, with a deliberate movement that seemed both tiny and monumental, he pressed his forehead gently against her palm. It was the leap of faith, not reckless, not hurried, but fully aware and intentional. Her voice was soft, a whisper in the stillness. You did it. You chose trust. It was both affirmation and release, a recognition of courage earned through weeks of small victories. He stayed pressed against her hand, trembling slightly, yet there was no panic, no flinch, only acceptance. The shelter seemed to exhale with them, the faint hum of heaters and the soft dripping of residual rain blending into a rhythm of relief and connection. The walls, the blankets, the straw, all became part of a sanctuary defined not by isolation but by shared presence. As the day progressed, the humans allowed him to explore more freely. Paws slid along the wet floor, nose tracing corners, ears flicking toward every scent. Yet with each exploration came return to the warmth of hands, the calm of presence, the safety of patience. Each tentative step reinforced the lesson that the world could be navigated without constant fear. Play began to emerge, small but unmistakable. A nudge at a blanket, a brief bark at the sound of dripping water, tail lifting subtly in recognition of safety. Trust was no longer theoretical. It was woven into each movement, each interaction, each heartbeat shared. Evening arrived with a gentle amber glow filtering through the shelter windows. He lay partially curled against the stranger's lap, fur damp but drying, muscles relaxing, ears flicking only occasionally. The storm outside had long subsided, leaving a quiet, reflective calm. He nudged her hand gently, then rested his chin against her knee, eyes closing for brief moments, fully allowing himself to exist without fear. The leap of faith, monumental in its simplicity, had carried him from panic into cautious comfort. Each breath, each touch, each shared glance solidified the fragile architecture of trust. By nightfall, he had navigated both literal and emotional storms, emerging not unscathed but transformed. He had confronted fear head-on, survived a near-chaotic escape, and chosen connection over instinctual flight. The humans had learned alongside him, their patience, courage, and vigilance tested and proven true. The shelter, once a place of tension and trepidation, had become a landscape of possibility. Blankets, cages, straw, and human hands were no longer sources of anxiety but foundations for exploration, interaction, and quiet play. The final moments of the day were intimate and understated. He lay fully against her, paws brushing her hands, tail flicking with restrained excitement. Half closed, ears relaxed, he allowed himself to imagine a life where moments of terror could be tempered with care, where fear could coexist with trust, where the leap of faith was not an act of desperation but a conscious choice. Outside, the night whispered softly against the shelter walls, the faint glimmer of moonlight pooling on wet concrete, reflecting the calm within. And in that silence he breathed, truly breathed. A creature reborn in patience, courage, and the enduring power of connection. The first rays of sunlight spilled through the shelter windows, golden and soft, washing the room in warmth that smelled faintly of straw and drying fur. He stretched slowly, muscles long and relaxed, a rare luxury after weeks of tension and vigilance. Every joint moved with careful deliberation. Yet there was an ease now, a freedom that had once seemed impossible. The world outside beckoned with possibilities rather than threats. The faint chirping of birds, the distant hum of traffic, and the subtle rustle of leaves whispering against one another in a gentle morning breeze. He inhaled deeply, nostrils flaring, tasting air laced with hope and safety. For the first time, the scent of the world wasn't a warning, it was an invitation. The humans moved around him, quietly preparing for the day, voices soft, laughter barely contained. The stranger knelt beside him, hands warm and steady, fingers brushing along his damp fur, ruffling gently. His eyes met hers, wide and unflinching, dark orbs reflecting trust earned and patience rewarded. He nudged her hand and she smiled, a slow, luminous curve that mirrored the joy swelling in her chest. There were no words, yet everything was communicated: belonging, safety, love. He had learned to rely on presence rather than instinct alone, to find courage and patience, and to discover the profound truth that he was no longer alone. The day was alive with subtle motion and quiet discoveries. He explored the shelter now with confident pause, sniffing corners that had once seemed menacing, circling blankets that had once been intimidating. Every sound, the soft tap of a paw, the low hum of a heater, the gentle murmur of a human voice, was catalogued without the constant tremor of fear. Other animals watched him with cautious curiosity, yet he greeted them with measured sniffing, a soft whine of recognition, and the first tentative wag of his tail. He realized, in a slow unfurling of understanding, that the world could be navigated with trust as a tool rather than fear as armor. Lunch came quietly, small portions offered in bowls placed with care. He approached deliberately, sniffed, then ate, savoring the act without retreating in panic. The humans observed, not with urgency, but with calm pride, witnessing the accumulation of victories, too subtle for headlines, yet monumental in personal significance. His movements were no longer jerky or instinctive. Each step was intentional, guided by a newfound rhythm of safety and choice. The small victories, the touch of a hand, the wag of a tail, the soft exhale of a sigh, were threads weaving a tapestry of trust and belonging. Afternoon brought light that shimmered off the wet concrete outside, pooling in warm patches across the floor. He paused by a window, nose pressed lightly to the glass, ears alert but relaxed. He watched the world beyond the shelter with curiosity instead of terror. Children walking past, leaves rustling in the gentle wind, stray birds hopping along puddles. The stranger knelt beside him, hand resting lightly on his back, offering silent companionship. The bond between them had matured, no longer tentative, now layered with understanding, patience, and the quiet certainty of safety. Play emerged organically. A crumpled blanket became a makeshift toy, paws swiping and nudging, tail lifting in small arcs of excitement. The humans watched, laughter soft but genuine, as he chased his own shadow across the concrete floor. Ears perked, eyes alight with joy. The shelter, once a landscape of tension, had transformed into a canvas for growth, exploration, and emotional healing. Every touch, every sound, every gaze was a lesson in connection. Fear still existed, lurking faintly in corners, but trust had become the dominant note in the melody of his life. Evening fell with a gentle amber glow. He lay fully stretched on a blanket, paws brushing against the stranger's hands, fur now clean and shiny, eyes half closed, ears relaxed. The room pulsed with quiet contentment. Heaters hummed softly, rain outside was a distant memory, and shadows no longer intimidated. Moments of reflection threaded through the calm. He had survived neglect, endured fear, and embraced the tentative hands that offered safety. The journey from abandoned alleyways to the warmth of this shelter had been arduous, filled with tiny victories, each one carved from patience, empathy, and courage. Dinner was quiet, a simple affair, yet it carried monumental significance. Each bite was an act of trust, a small affirmation of belonging. He paused between nibbles to nuzzle a hand, the action so delicate yet charged with meaning that it seemed to slow time itself. The humans responded with quiet murmurs of praise, soft laughter, and gentle encouragement. Connection, once fragile, now pulsed confidently between them. Every gesture reinforced the bond. The press of a head, the gentle brush of fingers, the synchronized rhythm of breathing in shared space. Trust had evolved into comfort and comfort into joy. Night settled over the shelter. The world outside was calm, the faint hum of distant cars and the soft rustle of leaves the only sounds. He lay beside the stranger, head resting lightly on her lap, chest rising and falling in a relaxed rhythm. The warmth of blankets and hands, the soft glow of lanterns, and the quiet presence of other animals around created a cocoon of safety. He blinked slowly, a gesture of both relaxation and recognition, understanding that home was not merely a place but a state of being forged through connection, care, and perseverance. In the quiet, reflective moments of night, he traced the journey from fear to trust in his mind. Shadows that had once dominated his world were now softened, reshaped by the hands that had patiently guided him. Every flinch, every retreat, every tentative paw step had led to this. A life where fear no longer ruled, where touch was not a threat, and where trust could be chosen. The leap of faith he had taken, the storm he had endured, and the patience he had accepted had forged a bridge between isolation and belonging. As the stranger stroked his fur one last time for the day, he lifted his head and met her gaze. In that silent exchange, there was acknowledgement, gratitude, and recognition of shared triumph. He had found home not only in the shelter's walls or the blankets strewn across the floor, but in the unwavering presence of someone who had refused to give up on him. The world beyond the shelter was still vast, unpredictable, and occasionally frightening, but he had discovered a safe place within it, a connection strong enough to endure uncertainty, tender enough to heal old wounds, and resilient enough to support growth. The night ended with him curled against her side, breathing slow and steady, ears flicking occasionally, eyes heavy with trust and contentment. The blankets, the warmth of hands, the subtle rhythm of shared life, all of it whispered a final lesson. Connection is powerful, patience is transformative, and love, even in its quietest forms, can change the trajectory of a life scarred by fear. Outside, moonlight reflected on the wet streets, casting gentle silver ribbons into the shelter. Inside, a creature once abandoned and wary now slept fully and freely, safe at last, home at last, in a world that had finally learned to keep its promises.